rattlesnakes to pythons, biologists at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida believe one of their scout Burmese pythons.
In 2019, a field researcher in the Florida Everglades stumbled onto something that stopped her cold. Dead pythons. Not one, not two. Dozens of them scattered across the sawgrass, bellies up, skin peeling in ways the textbooks didn't cover. No predator marks, no signs of a fight, just dead in ways that looked almost deliberate. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called the lab. And within 48 hours, a team of government scientists had established a restricted perimeter around 3 square miles of Everglades terrain. Visitors were told to leave. Researchers who had been working in the field for months were pulled out mid-project. And so, for 6 weeks, nobody outside that team knew what they'd found. What they discovered inside those pythons would force scientists to reconsider things they thought they fully understood about invasive species, ancient ecosystems, and what happens when a creature from one part of the world meets something that evolved specifically to destroy it. The python problem. To understand why this discovery rattled researchers to their core, you need to understand what Burmese pythons have already done to Florida. It started small. In the 1980s, South Florida had a booming exotic pet trade. Burmese pythons were popular, impressive animals. But when they got too large to manage, some owners did what irresponsible people always do. They released them into the grass and canals. The Everglades absorbed the first few, then a few more. By the 1990s, sightings were increasing steadily. By the early 2000s, what had been a fringe problem had become something else entirely. These snakes were reproducing faster than anyone had projected. A single female Burmese python can lay up to 100 eggs per clutch. In Florida's climate, with no natural predators, those eggs hatched into juveniles that grew into apex predators that hunted everything in sight and answered to nothing. The numbers tell the story better than words. Between 1997 and 2012, raccoon populations inside Everglades National Park dropped by 99.3%. Opossums fell by 98.9%. White-tailed deer sightings declined by 94%. The marsh rabbit essentially vanished. Burmese pythons weren't just living in the Everglades, they were consuming it. By 2010, the U.S. Geological Survey estimated the population at somewhere between 30,000 and 300,000 individuals. That range was that wide because nobody could actually count them. The pythons were perfectly camouflaged and almost impossible to locate unless you already knew where to look. Wildlife managers tried hunting programs, trapping campaigns, detection dogs, and cash bounties. None of it made a meaningful dent. The pythons were winning, and the scientific consensus by the mid-2000s was grim. The infestation was likely permanent, which is exactly why, when something started killing them, nobody knew whether to feel relieved. The first signs. The first dead python was found near the Anhinga Trail in the fall of 2018. A single adult female, roughly 14 feet long, dead with no obvious cause. The researcher who found it logged it as a curiosity and moved on. Pythons die for any number of reasons: extreme cold snaps, bacterial infections, injuries from territorial encounters. One dead python in 1 million acres of swamp didn't warrant alarm. But then there were more. Over the following 6 months, researchers cataloged 17 dead pythons across a 40-mile stretch of the Everglades interior. Each one showed the same pattern: spiral skin lesions running along the lateral surface of the body, internal hemorrhaging concentrated around the liver and spleen. And one other thing that nobody on the team had ever seen before in any snake species, anywhere in their careers. The oral tissue had turned black, not from post-mortem decomposition. The blackening had occurred while the snakes were still alive. The cellular breakdown started in the mouth and spread inward. In several specimens, the process appeared rapid, over the course of days rather than weeks. When the first tissue samples came back from the University of Florida's College of Veterinary Medicine, the lead researcher sent a single-line email to the rest of his team. It read, "We need to look at this together in person." He wouldn't elaborate. He requested a meeting. That meeting lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, the team began making calls. The investigation. What the laboratory analysis identified wasn't a known pathogen or any bacteria in any existing database. What the samples most closely resembled was a fungal network, but not one native to North America. When they ran full genetic sequencing on the organism, the results mapped to fungal strains found in the wetland systems of Southeast Asia, specifically in the river basins of Myanmar and Thailand, which happened to be the native range of the Burmese python. The working theory took shape quickly. Burmese pythons in their home range had evolved alongside this organism for potentially thousands of years. In Southeast Asia, the relationship was balanced. The fungus existed in the soil and water. The pythons carried trace exposure and had developed enough biological tolerance to coexist with it. Neither species overwhelmed the other. It was an equilibrium built over millennia, two species that had learned to coexist. But in Florida, something had changed. The organism had mutated. Cut off from its native ecosystem and the biological checks that kept it stable, the fungus had drifted genetically over the decades since the first pythons arrived. The version now established in the Florida Everglades wasn't quite the same organism the pythons had co-evolved alongside. It was similar enough in structure to successfully attack them, but different enough that the immunity the snakes carried was no longer sufficient to fight it off. Think of it this way. Imagine a pathogen your ancestors carried dormant for generations. Then, transplanted to a different continent and cut off from the pressures that kept it stable, it shifts just enough to turn against the host that brought it here. That was what was unfolding in the Everglades. And the deeper researchers went into the data, the more unsettled they became. Because the mutation hadn't produced a weak or inefficient organism, it had done the opposite. The new strain attacked the immune system first, overwhelming it before moving to the organs and then the nervous tissue. In controlled tests, survival rates dropped below 12%. The organism was extraordinarily good at what it did. What they found next. The evacuation decision came after the second phase of testing, and it came fast. For 3 months, the research team had focused entirely on the pythons, collecting tissue samples, mapping the die-off zones, trying to understand the scope of what was happening to the invasive population. Then someone raised the question that should have been asked sooner. What about everything else? Environmental sampling began in week 14 of the investigation. Soil cores, water column samples, tissue swabs from other reptile species in the affected zone, the kind of sweep that tells you whether you're dealing with an isolated event or something that has already moved beyond its original host. Lab results came back on a Thursday afternoon. The organism was not confined to the pythons. Trace concentrations had been detected across an 8-square-mile zone surrounding the original die-off sites. Tissue analysis from American alligators captured in the same area showed early-stage biological exposure markers, and samples taken from 2 native snake species, the Florida cottonmouth and the eastern indigo snake, showed similar early indicators. The eastern indigo snake is already one of the most endangered reptiles in North America. Its numbers had been gutted by habitat loss and the collapse of its prey base. And now the same organism killing the invasive snakes had found it too. The research team submitted findings to federal authorities on a Friday. The restricted access order was in place by Saturday morning. Researchers inside the perimeter were told to exit. Equipment used in the zone was quarantined. A specialist team was brought in from the CDC and the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. Nobody in the official communications used the word outbreak. But in the private conversations between the scientists who had been on the ground, a different word kept coming up. Containment. What happened after the restricted zone remained in place for 6 weeks? When the perimeter was finally lifted, the official public statement from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission described a naturally occurring fungal pathogen, a localized disturbance, and ongoing monitoring. It did not mention the mutation or how far the organism had drifted from its Southeast Asian origin strain. It did not mention the alligator samples. It did not mention the eastern indigo snake exposure findings, or the fact that a species already fighting extinction had now been brought into contact with an organism that nothing in the North American ecosystem had ever encountered before in its evolutionary history. Researchers who were on the ground during those 6 weeks described something they hadn't expected to feel when they first started working the case. Not relief that something was finally thinning the python population. Something harder to name. Something closer to dread. Because the Everglades had been absorbing the consequences of human decisions for a long time. The pythons were released by people. The pet trade brought them here. And the organism now moving through the ecosystem had arrived embedded in the bodies of animals that should never have left Southeast Asia in the first place. The Everglades did not create this problem. It inherited it. And now, in the slow and entirely indifferent way that nature always responds to disruption, it was reacting. As of 2024, environmental monitoring of the affected zone is ongoing. Python die-off events consistent with the pathogen have been documented in at least 3 additional areas. Surveillance of the eastern indigo snake population has been formally elevated in priority by conservation authorities. And somewhere out in 1 million acres of blackwater and sawgrass, something that traveled halfway around the world without anyone noticing, is still moving through the system, still spreading, still changing, still finding new hosts. The Florida python crisis was supposed to be a story about an invasive species we couldn't control. And for 30 years, that was the only story being told. But what's developing in the Everglades now is a different story. It's about what happens when you move living things across ecosystems, sever the biological relationships evolution spent thousands of years building, and carry organisms across an ocean that keep adapting long after you've stopped watching. The pythons came to Florida in a suitcase. The organism now killing them came with them, dormant and invisible, waiting for the conditions to shift just enough. We created those conditions, and the Everglades is still paying the price. If this story got under your skin, the next video is on screen right now. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.